For the third time in 3 decades, Ankara and Yerevan are trying to normalize relations. In a region plagued by rivalry, distrust, and historical grievances, this will be no easy feat. This is how a famous Caucasus expert, Thomas Deval, starts his latest article. Indeed, we have seen in recent months not only positive signals, but also concrete steps by Ankara and Yerevan, who seem committed to establish some relations finally. I'm Rusif Huseynov, and today my guest is Nareg Seferian, a US-based Armenian scholar whose expertise covers the Armenian-Turkey ties, among others. Mr. Seferian, thank you very much for accepting my interview request, for finding time for this conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure. You were a recipient of an interesting fellowship called Turkey Armenian Fellowship Scheme of Granting Foundation, and you lived in Turkey for some time for your research. I read your research before our interview. It's entitled "The Clash of Turkish and Armenian Narratives: The Imperative for a Comprehensive and Nuanced Public Memory." I must say it's a very good read, a very good material, in which you not only portray the prevailing narratives amongst Armenians and Turks towards one another, you also find overlapping aspects, mirroring narratives and gaps. Readers can see how you bullet-pointed main of these narratives. Are there narratives, either Turkish or Armenian, which are more noticeable in your understanding, or which can surprise you as well?
Well, I think it's meaningful to point out those overlapping bits and the surprise that comes when you think a little bit critically about prevailing narratives as manifestations of, let's say, classical nationalism. So among both prevailing nationalist narratives of Armenians and Turks, you have these very common elements that you see in many parts of the world, in what used to be the Romanov realm, the Habsburg realm, the Ottoman realm, but also in other parts of the world. Elements like a sense of indigeneity and a connection with territory. We are an ancient people and we have always been on this land, this kind of thing. A kind of exclusionary worldview, a privileging of key aspects of cultural identity like language and religion, and an implicit or explicit sense of superiority over other cultures. And also something which is again very common, things like rivalries over food or music. I remember this documentary I saw maybe 10 years ago, produced by a Bulgarian woman. It's called "This Song Is My Song" or "This Song Is Our Song." I wish I could remember the exact title. But this woman follows a melody. She goes all over the Balkans. She starts in Istanbul, she goes down to Greece, Albania, Macedonia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and it's a melody, it's a song that all of these people, they have their own version of it, but each of them somehow claims it as their own, and they give it some kind of national meaning. It's not just a fun song that everybody sings. It has some great cultural resonance. So these elements are something which peoples can identify with each other. Unfortunately, they are often mutually exclusive. It's a different thing to say, yes, I am Turkish, I speak Turkish. Yes, I am Armenian, I speak Armenian. Armenian and Turkish are separate languages. That's fine. It's another thing to say that, I don't know, Van is an ancient Armenian capital. No, Van is an integral part of the Turkish state, for example.
Yeah, interesting. Some of these overlapping narratives, like main one, is is having nationalism as the basis of, you know, Turkish or Armenian identities, or the attitude towards the West, as you mentioned, and mutual exclusivity, which means one community does not leave a room for another community for coexist. Turkish and Armenian narratives, we can say they can be mutually exclusive, they can be very similar, but what about the mirroring narratives?
I wonder how to identify and measure that discourse. It would be a very interesting study, and it probably comes from sometime in the 19th century. The idea of not just nationalism, but territorial nationalism is a rather European idea. And it's one of those tensions in the back and forth dynamic with the European world and with the great powers, especially in the last, let's say, century or half century of the Ottoman Empire. As you may know, in the Ottoman Empire, the sense of social or cultural identity was largely framed as religious. You had confessional groups, you had the millets, and that was a way of regulating social and even legal issues within the empire. The idea that one is a distinct nation from another one, this is not very complicated. But the additional layer that just because we are a different nation than this other nation, we need to have our own state. We need to have our own sovereign political entity. See, that's the complication. And this is what has caused, in my opinion, immense suffering over the past century and a half all over Eastern Europe and Western Asia, also other parts of the world. Now, the positive aspects of nationalism is bringing people together, and it's having the capacity to work together on a large scale, which you couldn't do before. If all you knew was your village and the world began and ended with your village, well, then all you're going to have is a village. So you have to acknowledge that nationalism is a powerful, positive rallying force. But unfortunately, in the Ottoman Empire, it ended up creating fractures, very, very deep fractures. Again, I wish I had the way to detect and measure that back and forth, because from what I understand, because the Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire were more exposed to Western ideas, more tied with Europe, trade or education, I dare say that it was among Armenians, first of all, perhaps also Greek communities, Bulgarian communities, or other such communities, that this nationalist idea first came about. It was early in the 19th century when the first modern Armenian dictionaries or atlases were produced, and they were produced in Europe. They only came to the Ottoman Empire later, right? And as far as I understand, it was this kind of reaction which led to, some time later, decades later, the imagination of a modern Turkish national identity. A Turkish nation in a modern sense was not on the agenda in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were ruling, they and their clique. It was not a Turkish empire. There's a noted Armenian-American scholar, Ronald Sunni. Actually, I'm privileged that he's on my dissertation committee, and I remember first hearing this idea from him. It's wrong to say Russian Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire or Turkish Empire. You have to emphasize Romanov, Ottoman, Habsburg.
It's about dynasties, exactly.
It's about the dynasties and their cliques and their families. The Russians were subjects of the Romanovs. The Turks were subjects of the Ottomans. They were not their own sovereign nation. And so this was, I think, maybe it's a little bit of a simplistic account, but I think this was the big tension in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire. And the Turkish national identity was a reaction to these other national identities, in particular the Armenian one. And as it turned out, it turned into a physical match, and well, the Armenian nationalist groups could only put up so much resistance. Footnote number 1, we can see this very similar process into the 20th century of Kurdish national identity within Turkey. Footnote number 2, we can see this very similar mirroring among Armenian and Azerbaijani national identity developments. Again, more in the 20th century, even within the Soviet Union, even during USSR times.
Yes, that's very interesting. Once again, I would like to advertise your interesting material, The Clash of Turkish and Armenian Narratives. And I believe those who observe the dynamics of Armenia-Turkey relations and those who try to analyze the current normalization process should study it and should have, should take notes from this material. Yeah, please.
I would like to jump in for just a second, because I do want to point out, I produced that very brief study about 5 years ago. And in that time, some things have changed. I still believe that the major obstacles that confront the normalization of relations between the Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Turkey are ideational. They're at the level of things like narratives. However, there has now appeared a very significant security component since the Second Karabakh War. So my argument before was that there is no real material dimension to that dynamic. I mean, the Turkish state has nothing to worry about, no threat can be perceived from the Armenian state in terms of security, in terms of the economy, in terms of demography. So it's really just a question of coming to terms with a difficult history and coming up with, I was hoping at the time, a shared narrative that was nuanced, not the same, but that had some kind of equitable treatment. But since then, because of the Second Karabakh War and the very immediate engagement of the Republic of Turkey in support of the Azerbaijani forces, there is now that very difficult layer added, that it's not even just a question of imaginations of history anymore. There is a very real security threat perceived in Yerevan in a way that it never was before.
I see. Yeah, thank you for this remark. I also wanted to add that what is discussed here in this report is the fundamental problems or obstacles. But of course, during and in the aftermath of the Second Karabakh War, new narratives must have emerged, especially on the Armenian side. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, you yourself had this experience of living in Turkey, for your study. What was your own experience, the experience of an Armenian in Turkey, even for a short time? What is your own narrative regarding Turkey?
Really, this has been an immense privilege. Even now, I feel quite blessed to have undergone what I underwent. And it happened, it happened in stages. When I started that fellowship with the Hrant Dink Foundation, God bless his soul, it was the 15th anniversary of his assassination just 1 or 2 days ago. It was not my first time in Istanbul that year. I had been to Istanbul before. I had been an intern at a publication. And, it's very exciting. It's a dynamic city. It's really a very interesting place to be as such, the city of Istanbul. And then to be an Armenian there, not only, I was not an Armenian Istanbul. They're Bolsahai. So in Armenian, we call the city of Istanbul Bolis, which is short for Konstantinopolis, Constantinople. And we Armenians call ourselves Hai, you might know. And so the Armenians of Istanbul are Bolsahai. And that is its own community, its own world, which is rather complex. And I had not been exposed to it before. But I'll tell you a story about how I went with a Bolsahai friend. My first time in Istanbul almost 10 years ago, we went to the Dolmabahce Palace. Very lovely, very touristy thing to do. We went, there was the tour guide, we were going around, it was in English, the tour guide. And at one point when the tour guide was talking about the architects, the family, the Balyan family, I jumped in and I specified that this is in fact an Armenian family. He was not mentioning this. And he said, oh yes, how do you know? I said, well, I am Armenian and so is my friend. So after the tour, my friend was upset at me. She said, why did you tell him that I am Armenian? And I said, what's the big deal? And she said, no, Nareg. She said, you are here this week, you're leaving next week. This is not something that we reveal to just anyone. And I thought this was very strange. Fast forward some years later, and I am there again. Now for months, I've been living in Istanbul. And at one point, yes, when I think I was getting a sandwich somewhere, and I was speaking in my, broken Turkish or intermediate level Turkish. And the sandwich guy was like, oh, how come you're speaking Turkish? I said, oh, my ancestors, they come from Marash. I heard some Turkish as a child, but I've just studied it now. And he says, really, they come from Marash. And then I told him, Ermeniyim, I'm Armenian. I just shrugged my shoulder. And he said, yes, he made a little, sometimes they say olsun. It happens. It happens that somebody is Armenian. And after that, I thought, my goodness, why did I express myself that way? Why didn't I just tell him, Ermeniyim, I'm Armenian. This is a thing, What's wrong with that? Why was I sort of apologetic about it? I thought this was such a strange experience, but I felt what my friend was telling me some years earlier, that this is not something that is just automatically revealed. Of course, with your name and where you went to school, these kinds of things, it becomes obvious. But it's a very, very strange psychology. So I have also been exposed to the Armenian diaspora, the Armenian diasporas, various communities around the world. And for the most part, you are a community in a larger society. You have your own church or your own school, maybe you speak a different language at home, maybe you eat different food, but that's just what I mean. You have a little bit of a strange name maybe, but you are a citizen of that country, you participate in society, you're an integrated member of just whatever the country it is you're living in. You are French, you are Brazilian, you are Australian, whatever it is. But that's not the way it is in Turkey. That is not the way it is for the Armenians of Istanbul. They have a sort of psychological force field around them. They have to have this, they have to play something like a game. I have to emphasize that for a vast majority of the Armenians of Istanbul, they're just living their lives and they have their everyday life, they have their work, and there's really no problem in just everyday life. But every once in a while, some things happen. When the Karabakh War happened, the Second Artsakh War happened, there was people driving around the streets in neighborhoods where Armenians live with Azerbaijani flags, honking their horns, being,
I remember those
provocative.
Yeah.
Yes. So things like this, and I'm talking about specifically the open Armenians of Istanbul, as open as they can be, because we also have people in Turkey who know they are Armenian in whole or in part, and they keep this a secret. Or outside of Istanbul, you have other kinds of communities. You have the very interesting Hemshin community. I don't know if you have heard of this.
Armenians in the Eastern Anatolia.
Muslim, some are not. They speak clearly an Armenian dialect. Some have a kind of Armenian identity. Some refuse to claim any Armenianness. So there is really, people have done studies on, sociological, anthropological studies of the Armenians of Turkey, because it is a very, very fascinating phenomenon. The final component of this phenomenon are the Armenians of Armenia, who have moved to Istanbul in particular, but also other parts of Turkey.
As labor migrants, mostly?
They are immigrants. I mean, I guess you can call them immigrants. Maybe some of them are illegal, maybe some of them are not, but that's where they found work, and that's where they have ended up, and that's where they have been living lives. There is actually, I think it's like a semi-illegal school somewhere in Istanbul. They call it the Hrant Dink School. They named it after Hrant Dink of blessed memory. They try to have, because children who are not registered as locals, they cannot go to a local school. And so they have this arrangement, an informal arrangement set up somewhere to at least provide some kind of education, an Armenian education. Really, really fascinating phenomenon. It's easy to paint it in very black and white terms. Oh, I don't know, in religious terms, you see this a lot. Oh, those evil Turks, how they are massacring the poor innocent Armenians. Well, yes and no, but there's also so many other elements. There's so many families of Armenian and Turkish, husband, wife, so many. So it doesn't take long to scratch that surface and to find a very rich and fascinating world. And I was deeply privileged to have been exposed to that.
Thank you for this insightful information you've shared, Mr. Seferian. Now, back to this actual topic about Armenia-Turkey rapprochement. In your report, you rightly mentioned that the normalization process between the Republic of Armenia and Republic of Turkey does not have only two actors, only two states. It's actually usually more than two states, because in some instances you have Azerbaijan as part of this process. You have an important non-state actor, which is the Armenian Diaspora. You have a lot of foreign actors, some Western countries or Russia or some international organizations. You also have a lot of problems which are worth discussing: moral, ethical, religious principles, legal disputes, economic calculations, etc. No government in Yerevan has ever made a precondition for establishing relations the recognition of the 1915 events as genocide. But the genocide discourse must be very strong, as are the sentiments regarding the Treaty of Sevres or the Wilsonian Armenia. So I have these two questions in this regard. How do these discourses fit into the normalization process? And second, what would the position of the Armenian diaspora be towards the Armenia-Turkey normalization? Because it is an important actor, non-state actor, whose say must be considered.
Well, in fact, it's impossible to talk about the Armenian diaspora as a single entity. There is no such thing. There are various communities spread all over the world. You have particular leaders, particular groups, and yes, you can point to a kind of prevailing discourse among at least one family of diaspora, Armenian diaspora actors. The more nationalist side is often affiliated with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or the Dashnaktsutsion, but not only. And then you have other actors, you have other individuals, you have other influential, maybe wealthy people. It's very, very difficult to point to something and say, this is what the Armenian diaspora's position is. It's unfair to do so. it's very rare that the Republic of Armenia and a wide consensus of Armenian diaspora representatives have come together. It's very rare in the last 30 years. It has happened a few times, but it's very rare. And when it comes to normalizing relations with Turkey, it has not happened. Since the beginning, really, the position of the Republic of Armenia has been a very practical one. Let's just say we recognize each other, and they do. Let's open our border. Let's have embassies. Let's just have movement of people and goods and have very basic consular relations. Everything else, imaginations of the past, Treaty of Sèvres, Treaty of Kars, all of these, let's put to one side. This has been the position of Yerevan, but Ankara has not responded in that way. One of the former foreign ministers of Armenia, Vartan Oskanyan, he was foreign minister for 10 years, between 1998 and 2008, he recently wrote an article and he emphasized that what he is seeing today from the Turkish government is a repetition of that pattern. The process of normalization somehow is useful for the Turkish state. I suppose it is useful in order to demonstrate to Western partners that, yes, there is a process. But the actual end result is not clear. The previous preconditions included the recognition of Turkey's territorial integrity and no more encouragement of genocide recognition. These are anyway things that the Armenian government has not had much of a hand in. Okay, maybe genocide recognition was something the Armenian government could pull back from. The third precondition was about Karabakh, about a resolution to the Karabakh conflict favorable to Azerbaijan. Now this is in flux. This situation is in flux at the moment. It's not fully clear. I suppose there has been a resolution favorable to Azerbaijan, but not fully. But now there is the issue of the Zangezur corridor, and this has also been adopted by the Turkish government. And so the argument is, look, this is just yet another precondition that has appeared, and so once again the Turkish government is operationalizing the process rather than trying to achieve some kind of actual resolution. So this might be a little bit skeptical, a little bit cynical, but we also are seeing, at this moment anyway, today, towards the end of January 2022, we are seeing very limited movement in this regard. When it comes to the Treaty of Sèvres itself, well, this continues to exist in Turkish discourse, the Sèvres syndrome.
Sorry for interrupting, because officially there is no public statements from the Yerevan government, but these discourse exist in the Armenian society. Could you please touch upon how it is perceived in Armenia and in Turkey?
Absolutely. Well, in Turkey, the Sèvres syndrome, as it is sometimes called, is a prevailing anxiety about a loss of territory. The Western powers want to dismember our country. This sentence was very real for over 100 years. And in the end, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. In fact, the Eastern question, whether you also want to say the Armenian question or the Kurdish question, this was very real. The Treaty of Sèvres was going to be an even bigger blow to what remained of the Ottoman Empire. It didn't happen. Then you had the Treaty of Lausanne, the establishment of the modern Turkish Republic 100 years ago. But for 100 years, there is no demonstrable evidence of any similar initiatives by the Western powers or anyone else. There is the anxiety, especially of Kurdish nationalism, for the territorial integrity of Turkey. So I would say that this Sèvres syndrome it continues in a kind of inertial manner, but it is less, there is less substance to it today, but it still is used as a rhetorical device. From the Armenian perspective, this was the imagination of Wilsonian Armenia. This has been a part of the public memory, certainly in the Armenian diaspora for decades, not in Soviet Armenia. In Soviet Armenia, there was another episode of a couple of decades when there were demands for the regions of Kars and parts of Trabzon, so more access to the Black Sea. These were, for some decades, under the control of the Romanov Empire. And so during Stalin's time, there were demands for those territories. There were demands for access to the straits, to military bases on the straits. But that ended in 1953. I think the USSR officially rescinded any such claim. The USSR and Turkey had an unusual dynamic too over 60, 70 years. Then in more recent times, maybe 15 years ago, maybe a little bit less, this Sevres idea came up again in Armenia, especially through the efforts of a former diplomat, former ambassador to Canada, Ara Papian. He was the pioneer who introduced this notion of operationalizing international law, public international law, as one element of activism against Turkish policy, demands for territory. In truth, it's not a strong argument. Legally, actually, the Treaty of Sèvres is not ratified. It's not a valid document. The Treaty of Lausanne supersedes it. And really, from the perspective of public international law, it's not a strong case. From the perspective of human rights, from the perspective of cultural rights, minority rights, and also from the perspective of political discourse, there's something to be said. There's something to be said about remembering that episode and the contingencies that created the map that we have today. And so this is appealing. This is appealing for nationalist Armenians. This is not appealing for the Republic of Armenia. And in the foreign policy of the Republic of Armenia, this kind of discourse has not prevailed. But for the sake of, I don't know, populism or getting votes, or just as yet another component of Armenian nationalist discourse, this has proven to be resilient.
I see. Thank you, Mr. Seferian. Last but not least, again, is normalization process or rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey, which factors, in your opinion, can either boost or slow down or even impede the whole process? How do you read these whole dynamics in general?
I think this is a very problematic process because at the very outset, it has had at least two complications. I agree that it should simply be a very practical decision. Let's just open our borders. In fact, even if we don't want to have full embassies in our capitals, let's just have little consulates and let's just have a very, very practical, pragmatic relationship. You know, the Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Turkey have had a very paradoxical relationship in the last 30 years. So these are two neighboring countries, immediately neighboring. They recognize each other, but their land border has been closed for almost 30 years. They do not have diplomatic representations with each other. But guess what? Their citizens can enter one another's countries, no problems. And they have regular flights between Yerevan and Istanbul. Yes, in the last 2 years, those flights have not been functioning. They will function again soon, according to the latest reports.
Yes.
So this is a very strange thing. I don't know if there are any two countries in the world like this. There is a a Turkologist based in Yerevan, Varujan Keramyan. He put out a tweet very recently about how the resurrection of these flights is being framed as a step forward to kind of progress. Well, those flights existed even when you had the deepest disagreements on genocide this or Karabakh that. Those flights existed. People want to come and go. They want to do business. They want to be tourists. Now, I don't know how many Turkish tourists came to Armenia on those flights. I don't think many did. But to me, it would have made more sense to have just had this very, very practical agreement. So the first complication is, again, making the conditions more than they need to be. Zangezur corridor, I don't know, territory, genocide, and so on. There's no need for these things. Let's just we can put them, there's no need for the issue linkage. This only makes it more difficult. The second complication is the very problematic degree of legitimacy that the government in Yerevan has borne over the last few years. When Mr. Pashinyan and his team came to power in 2018, it was an exciting time. It had a very high degree of legitimacy. It was truly, truly a people's movement. A vast, vast majority of the population of Armenia, probably a good majority of Armenians outside of Armenia also were quite excited and quite optimistic. There were many shortcomings and mistakes that the Pashinyan government made. The war was devastating and disastrous, and ever since the war, it has been a very mixed bag. There were elections in June, new parliamentary elections in June, extraordinary elections, and as it turned out, Pashinyan and his team won.
He won again, yeah.
He won again, not with a vast, vast majority, not with a 70-80% majority, in fact, with barely 50-51%. But he did win again, and it was a free and fair. I mean, if there were some violations, they were probably quite minor. So, in fact, yes, Mr. Pashinyan and his government are ruling Armenia, but there continue to be a series of scandals and missteps, and it's very discouraging. And engagement with Turkey has been added to that list. There has been much talk about the special envoys represented in order to carry out these discussions. From the government of Turkey, Serdar Kılıç is a well-seasoned diplomat with decades of experience in the Turkish Foreign Ministry, former ambassador to the United States, yep. An accomplished individual. From the Armenian side, Ruben Rubinian, you know, an enthusiastic young man, yes, a part of Mr. Pashinyan's team, deputy speaker of the parliament, former deputy foreign minister, but not, they seem to be of different calibers. So this is not an encouraging point. As such, the foreign policy establishment of Armenia has been enervated, has been weakened in the last year at least. Yes. So this is another complication. I remember when these names were first announced, it was a prominent Armenian Diaspora newspaper, well affiliated with the Tashnak Sutyun, which the headline was Armenian genocide denier appointed envoy to Armenia. And I thought this was a little bit amusing because anybody appointed by the Turkish government to engage with Armenia is going to be an Armenian genocide denier. I'm sorry, that is the position of the Turkish government. I don't know what you're expecting. Okay, but that's still something you can work with. Again, this issue linkage does not need to be a part of the process. Meeting in Moscow is another layer of complication. I don't know if that is seen in a positive light or in a negative light necessarily, but it is the fact.
This is why the Turks now offered to have the next round of meeting either in Yerevan or Ankara, not a third country.
Well, that remains to be seen. I guess the positive point from that meeting was both foreign ministries issued the exact same statement, a very bland statement, but the exact same statement. At least back in 2009, when the protocols were initiated, Zurich, Switzerland, more of a neutral venue, and the participation of Moscow and Washington in that process, also Paris, Brussels. It seemed to have more of a buy-in, and again, it could have been a very, very simple, straightforward, practical decision. So this time it's very, very unclear. As I mentioned before, also the participation of the Turkish government in the Second Karabakh War is a concerning element everywhere, whether in Armenia or in the diaspora. This is this makes the prospect very different than, let's say, back in 2009, 2010.
I see. Thank you a lot, Mr. Seferian, for this interesting conversation and for your inputs. I appreciate it.
It's an honor. Thank you very much for this opportunity.